Hey guys, welcome to 8vbebop.
We're here talking about bass trombone and jazz bass trombone because that's what we love so much.
Co-hosted by myself, Gina Benalcazar.
And me, Chris Glassman. And if you want to look me up, you can find me on facebook.com or instagram.com/chris.glassman or Brass Glassman. And you can find me on my website, chrisglassmanmusic.com.
And you can find me on Facebook or instagram.com/Badita or my website, ginabenalcazar.com. Let's get started. So today we're kind of talking about just beginning the whole process of learning how to improvise.
Yeah, I think improvising itself on bass trombone can seem like a tall ask because you have to navigate an instrument that's not usually used for improvising nowadays. But it's really not as hard as you might think to get into. What do you think, Gina?
I agree. And then, we talked about it on the first episode. Reginald Chapman also spoke about it. If we address the instrument kind of just as an instrument and not the bass trombone, I think we can, we can cover a lot of ground just thinking of it as any other instrument.
Yeah. And just like I think a large portion of people who are going to learn how to improvise on jazz bass trombone probably already have some kind of classical training. They might be a classical bass trombone player because that's really where the standard is as far as bass trombonists go. The thing that really comes and gets a little bit difficult is just that you have to work on aural skills and training your ear to be stylistically accurate in the music that you're going to play, just as you would learn excerpts and have them be accurate and stylistically appropriate.
Mm-hmm. And you have to be okay with starting from ground zero again, which is the biggest thing, because a lot of times for bass trombonists specifically, they're starting late or later in their musical journeys. So it's really hard to stop in the middle of you making so much progress and sounding so good and then going back to ground zero and starting fresh and something that you're not going to sound good at first.
Right. The nice thing about it, though, is that I learned that all the practices, so I actually started on classical music first, but all the practices of, notes being how they should be, correct ends and beginnings of notes, everything like that carries over as you enter in jazz. It's just got a different sound to it. It's got like a different feel, and the rhythm is of a higher importance as far as feeling.
Yeah, but it's all music at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking of like the aspects, like maybe articulation is different, but it's not separate.
Mm-hmm.
Or the style is different, but it's not separate. Like there's still eighth notes and there's still slurring and you still have to articulate and you still have to phrase. Kind of helps with the process of diving into like a new genre of music.
Yeah, and specifically diving into a new genre of music, I think Gina agrees with me too. The first thing that you have to do is just do a lot of listening. That's like of the utmost importance. Just because you want to know, like you have to listen when you say you want to learn a new language, you want to learn French. First thing you got to do is you got to go online and listen to some people who are native French speakers speak French so that you at least know what you're getting into. So I think the same thing applies for jazz. So you just got to find some really amazing recordings or just find out what jazz sounds like.
Mm-hmm. And then learning the language the same way that we allow ourselves to learn languages or learn any kind of skill when we're a child. It's starting from maybe a gesture or then you learn one word at a time and then you learn maybe broken sentence. I can have milk. Can I have milk? Where you can phrase them into questions and then phrase them into bigger sentences and then statements before you even think about making your solo sound perfect.
Yeah. I think something that I do is that it got me into sort of the feeling of jazz is that I went online and I would sight read along solos that were written out, like really good solos at like really slow speeds, like maybe at half speed. I play like a JJ solo that's on YouTube or something. And what that does is it helps me sort of connect the dots between, okay, this is playing. I don't have to transcribe yet. I'm just getting the sound. And I want to hear what JJ sounds like and how I can sort of imitate that.
Yeah, that's super good at getting phrasing too, because I feel like a lot of times people just dive in. They're like, I'm going to learn the language. I'm going to learn how to improvise. But most of it is phrasing and how you articulate everything, how you sound when you're doing it.
Yeah. It's hard to connect the standard of sound and style with jazz music, tying it to the bass trombone because it's not typically viewed as something that can be stylistically appropriate. But I just try to take like the instrument out as much as I can of the equation. It's just like, okay, this is, even like JJ, even thinking about JJ down an octave can sometimes be difficult. But I just think, okay, doesn't matter. I'm just playing octaves. I'm just trying to match him an octave down. I'm just trying to make it sound like JJ just for some reason had like low overtones out the wazoo.
Yeah. And then and kind of taking from other instruments too, because
Yes.
like for the longest time trombone didn't have anything to listen to either. Then it just
Right.
stopped JJ, from
Exactly.
becoming JJ.
Hmm.
So being able to like reach out in other instruments, and the same thing, the overtone sound. It's such a cool sound too.
Yeah,
So
it is. It's such a cool sound. So once you've done a lot of listening to a lot of different instruments too, not just trombone, listening to saxophone, trumpet, bass, drums, piano. I had like a friend just give me a list of like three players on each instrument to like listen to, because when they're the band leader, they have like a specific sound versus like being a sideman. So,
yeah, for sure. And then also kind of when it comes to thinking of standards for the instrument, I like to think of like maybe if you just think about yourself as a bass player or a trombone player, because
yeah.
there's certain standards that are like all saxophone players will know these standards, all trumpet players will know, etc. And the same thing for
Yeah,
like Laura is a trombone tune.
that is. Yeah.
And Trichotism is a bass tune. So it could be
Hmm.
a bass trombone tune.
Exactly. Yeah. And going into learning, she's talking about learning standards, learning tunes. Start with the thing that everybody does. I would just say start with the blues.
Mm-hmm.
Start by learning a blues, learning, getting comfortable with the melody, and really, honestly, playing the blues on piano. Just
Oh
being
yeah.
able to play the root and either the third or the seventh, basically being able to play the roots in one chord tone as you're playing the form of the blues, because that gets your brain really acclimated to
Mm-hmm.
how the voice leading works. And I started at like, I would do a blues at like 65, 70 beats per minute because I have almost no piano skills. Seriously, I have none. I have no piano skills.
I say also a lot of things when it comes to learning like a tune just from scratch, outlining the chord from the bottom up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like maybe a chorus through just play the bass note, like on the trombone, play the bass
Mm-hmm.
note every,
Mm-hmm.
bar, and then bass third, bass
Yeah.
third, every bar, and then bass third, fifth, and going all and it just adding chord tones, and then if you want to add color tones, then starting from the top, like starting from the 9, 7, 5, 3, 1,
Yeah.
just to kind of get familiar with the sound of it, even if you're still looking at the changes, just to get familiar with the sound of the blues and the dominant, because that's also not a natural sound to be starting on a dominant chord. We're like
Right.
used to major, but the
Yeah.
dominant sound is something you have to get inside your ear. So that's like a really good way to start.
Yeah. And then when you get more comfortable with that, learning a bass line, just finding a really standard, I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of like online PDFs of just like bass lines that you can play. And the nice thing about our instrument is that you can just read directly what the bassist would play and just play it.
Mm-hmm.
Even though bass plays down an octave, if you want it comfortable, you can just play it where it is, or you can play it down an octave. I'm always thinking bass lines when I'm playing tunes all the time. So I'm thinking about what the bass is doing. Then that gives me so much harmonic and melodic information.
Yeah, and also transcribing bass lines is incredibly helpful too. So if you're like learning a blues, I remember when I was learning Bags Groove and I transcribed the solo, and then I was like, man, I'm gonna learn the bass line. Not only it gave me a lot of bass vocabulary to walk, but then it made me realize that a lot of it was there's like a pattern. There's like a pattern for how the bass line is played in certain bars, and there's different
Yeah.
patterns that you can use. But if you learn like one or two of those patterns, you can play bass lines over any other kind of tune as well.
Absolutely. I've done a little bit of work with one of our mentors, Mr. Rodney Whitaker, and because I was doing a little bit of working on making materials for his classes, and he talks a lot about that with bass lines, how it's very simple motifs that you use. You get comfortable at transposing them, and they like a lot of time, especially with the blues, tend to use the bebop scale.
Mm-hmm.
So like you already are starting getting comfortable with the language of bass lines as well as the scales and chord vocabulary that you need to be like an effective improviser.
It also opens up a world of chromaticism,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of times when it's not just about like walking up and down the arpeggio. A lot of times when you're listening to bass players, or if you're like reading off of a handout, you'll notice that a lot of times a root note is getting approached chromatically, and
Yeah.
then you start to think chromatically from the root up and down, which kind of gives you, even if you don't have any language, just like a little slew of notes to play around with if you're
Mm-hmm.
improvising.
Yeah. I think something that like grade school is really good at teaching students, and I also am really encouraging, is to just getting comfortable using the blues scales as well. Just because it's really hard to play a note in the blues using like the blues scale off the tonic that sounds bad. They're gonna all be like killing. Just being comfortable with the scales, and just I would learn the scale and then I would go and steal something really specific. You know, Curtis Fuller is amazing at playing just a blues scale and making like an entire solo out of it. So just having like specific little quips or licks that you can play that are blues ideas that are really effective, I think, help me get into the sound of jazz music.
The blues is everything.
Yeah.
So if you learn the blues over a blues, you can play the blues over any other standard, a
Yeah.
modal tune. You can play it over pop tunes. You if you have the blues locked down, you can play it over anything, and you have like access to just a general vocabulary that's going to give you, you know, access to lots of different types of songs.
Yeah. So we talked about listening and getting comfortable with the sound of the music, learning about how the chords function either through bass lines or practicing just playing the root notes of chords as you're going through specific, and then learning a tune like a blues. These three things will all really set you up to start. And then I think maybe the next step would be a very, very elementary transcription, maybe starting with like a really simple solo. What's like one of your favorite simple solos?
Well, one of the ones that I always give, it's not simple, but it's
Right.
simple enough where you can like record it probably at tempo is JJ Solar.
Yeah, that's a great solo. Yeah, and when I say simple, I don't mean simple as in bad, because
Yeah.
really some of the I think a lot of people think, oh well, jazz, the most killing jazz musicians are the ones that can play the most complex, playing everything, playing 40 changes in one change, you know, but simple is in oftentimes better, I think.
Yeah, I remember when I was transcribing, I feel like the hardest stuff, and maybe not to write out, but to internalize is the simple things. Because when you're getting to simple things, it's simple and it's strong because of the phrasing and how all the intent behind it and the motive that led to that place. So a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times it's that simple stuff that's like the most meaningful, and you have to sit and you really listen and absorb it because you can't just play it back and plug it in. It's
Yeah.
everything about jazz is in those simple phrases.
Yeah, and I think about solos as like the great speeches of all time. And it's so easy with a speech to just ramble. But
Yeah.
some of the greatest speeches of all time are known because they're so poignant and they just use the exact right word or phrase that they need to get their point across. And I think soloing works exactly the same way.
Yeah, and that kind of means that you have to already kind of know how you're going to start at least, or how you're going to phrase from beginning to end. That's not to say that you're memorizing a solo. It's not like you wrote it out and you're playing the exact solo you intended, but kind of listening as like maybe the solo before you is progressing, or having an idea, at least if you're just starting, how you're going to start, and then from
Mm-hmm.
there how you want to develop. Because if you're going in blind, it's the same thing when you talk, you just ramble sometimes. But if you kind of have an idea, and they say that JJ always knew what he was going to play, because he knew, I'm going to start with like maybe a blues phrase, or maybe I'm going to start with a quote. At the beginning of Solar, he starts with a quote of
Mm-hmm.
Crimea River.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was like, then at that point I'm going to develop, maybe I'm going to go into bebop, and just having like, even if it's a general idea of where you're going to go, like I'm going to start with a quote, and then I'm going to go into the blues, and then I'm going to go into bebop, and then I'm going to shred over this, and then here I'm going to play another simple phrase, and I'm going to end with another blues. But kind of having an idea at least, and then things change because maybe you don't execute it the way you want to, or the rhythm section doesn't have the same idea in mind. So being able to change the path is always important, but at least having some kind of plan is really helpful.
One thing that's really important to do, I think, is once you know a tune, is you go and find somebody to play with.
Mm-hmm.
I always emphasize playing with someone like who's gonna really kick your butt, like in a uplifting and like respectful way. They're gonna really give you a kick in the boot, especially like honestly rhythm section players. I always Every time I play with a rhythm section, I always feel like I get my butt kicked, just because I feel like being a rhythm section player means you have to know like 3 times more about the music than being like a horn player. Because a horn player, you can just like, you know, you can kind of like fudge your way through it,
Yeah.
and just do some acrobatics, and people will be happy. They'll be like, wow, he moved his arms around a lot. You play that trombone. I'm entertained.
Yeah, and it's really humbling too to do that, because you're kind of putting yourself in a position for, like, you're deciding, I'm going to go here with people who already know what they're doing, especially if, I mean, we're talking about beginning improvisation, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
You're putting yourself in a position where you're going to be like, you know, exposed a little bit, and it's really scary, but it's a lot of times it's scary because you think people are going to judge you, like, oh, this guy doesn't. But if it makes you feel any better, people are always respectful when you're willing to surrender to the music and
Yeah.
like humble yourself and learn something new from scratch. People understand. Everybody, we all started from zero. So if you're going to play with someone who's like killing and you're intimidated by and you're nervous that they're going to judge you, they have also been at zero and they've also
Hmm.
felt that way. And either they're not going to judge you and you don't have to worry about it, or if they are judging you, it doesn't matter, because people who are trying to judge you, it has more to do with themselves than it has to do with you.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that is really the biggest hurdle for most people is that, and I mean, especially with students in middle and high school, if they're trying to, the biggest thing is just getting them to stand up and play something,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I don't think that's exclusive to that age bracket either. I mean, it's hard for me to get up and stand up and do and play, you know. It's just the act of like you're spotlighting and singling yourself out and saying, okay, now here is my spontaneous creation, we're doing this right now in real time. That's a big hurdle to overcome. And I think the first step is just going. The first solo I ever played live at a gig, I dropped my slide on the third note. So I was like, I know. It was, but when I got done, I finished my solo that was just completely decimated. I picked up my slide and I was like, well, it's only up from here. It couldn't be any
Yeah.
worse than it's like I couldn't get any worse than that. I couldn't be worse than me dropping my slide on the third note. I went for a low B because it was a G blues, and I just whoop, down it went.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I thought the first solo that I took, it was over Just Friends.
Oh
And it was,
wow.
yeah, it wasn't like I was terrified and I didn't know how to. I remember I wrote down the notes on my sheet music because the
Yeah.
band director had us go in a circle and all of us, we were auditioning. Like, he didn't tell us about an audition, he just said we're going to see who plays the best solo, and then went around the band. And I didn't know anything about yeah, I was like a junior. I didn't start improvising until I was in college.
Yeah.
This was junior in high school, and he just was like, everybody play a whatever. And so I had the notes written out on my, and I just picked random ones.
Mm-hmm.
I would just
Yeah.
look at them and I was like, I'm just going to play the random notes. And then I don't remember what I played, but apparently it was okay because he decided that I was going to do it. And so he wrote me out a solo,
Oh
which is
wow.
also helpful because even though, like, in that moment I wasn't improvising, sitting down with him, going through the process of writing out the solo, and then being able to ask him, like, wait, but why did you write, and then why did you choose to do this instead of blah 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 blah, and then just witnessing the process of composing what would be a solo. And that's kind of like what's happening on stage in musicians'
Mm-hmm.
mind when they're composing, spontaneously.
Yeah.
Was really helpful. But then also being able to maneuver it on the horn, I was like, wow, okay, so this is kind of what it feels like to play over like F or B flat,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And if you're trying to play in sort of the straight head beat a bop swing idiom, which if you don't know, that's basically where Gina and I are sort of we've been sort of groomed as in the straight ahead bebop sort of sound. So that's why we're talking so much about vocabulary and so much about like blues and everything, is because we personally that was part of our journey as growing to be improvisers. But I think the process of actually writing out a solo teaches a lot about composition, which is also another hurdle that jazz musician, if you're coming from maybe the classical realm and you're not a composer, composing itself is another skill that you develop when you start improvising. But then all of a sudden you go from, oh, well, now I go from composing and having an eraser and I can edit and change notes to I'm doing it in real time. It's putting in the air. Everyone hears it right now. Boom. So the process of sitting down, writing out a solo, and just just trying your hand at composing something when you can erase it, I think helps me out a lot too.
Yeah, and then you'd be surprised because a lot of times what I do with younger students that are first learning how to improvise, they'll be playing a note and they'll stop when they hit, like, we'll be playing an F blues and they'll hit like a B natural and they stop. And I always tell them, don't stop what you're playing, because a lot of times the biggest difference between a right note and a wrong note is whether or not you can justify it. Like, a B
Mm,
over an F is a sharp 11. So if you play something confidently, you can justify it. Just the act of playing something confidently and then resolving or making your way back to the right note is a way of like demonstrating like an idea being followed through. And that is like a beautiful solo written, is ideas being followed through. And a lot
Yeah.
of times, like if you transcribe your own solo that you think was bad and you like notice all the wrong notes, you could be like, well, actually that was a sharp 11 and this was a flat 13, and just getting used to the sounds. And then the fact that like I mean you know, you want to develop language and stuff like that, that's super important, but not letting the lack of it stop you from trying it.
That is just developing this, like I call it the MacGyver skill of just being able to like get your way out of a weird
Oh
situation.
yeah.
Say you like you play like a weird note that you don't like, just being able to be like, okay, I play this O note, I own it. Is it a famous
Yeah.
Miles Davis quote where he's like, if you play a wrong note, play it again?
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's like you
There's
could get
another
yourself out of
quote.
it. Yeah.
There's like one that's like, if you play a wrong note, play two more wrong notes and then resolve.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So my teacher, when I was first learning how to improvise, because I was so scared of playing a wrong note, he taught me about enclosures, which is just basically you have a note and you play above it, below it, and then you resolve to it. So if you play a wrong note, which I guess the only direction you could go from a wrong note is one way up or one way down, but learning the enclosure, so I would land on a note and I would know all the like for all 12 of the notes, I would know how to enclose it and resolve to something else. So if I hit a note that was wrong, I could enclose it. And it kind of was like an empowering feeling because I was like, okay, so at least I know when I get to a wrong note how I'm going to get out of it.
Yeah.
But I feel like that was also like, for me, it was super helpful. But a lot of times it's as simple as just you played a wrong note, move it up a half step or down a half step, which on trombone is so easy.
Yeah, yeah. So here's a couple of tracks that we wanted to talk about, just so you can check out and get comfortable with sounds on solos that are pretty easy to digest. The first one is J.J. Johnson on Solar, and then also Miles Davis on Solar, because that will give you some sort of context of some of the contrasts that they have. And just a quick disclaimer: we talk a lot about the blues, but Solar is not a blues; it's a minor tune. It just happens to be 12 bars. So another one to check out is there's two really good recordings on YouTube of J.J. Johnson also playing "Now's the Time" with Sonny Stitt and Howard McGee. It's a smoking recording, and you can see him play live, which for me is also the last two are Curtis Fuller on Blue Train, and I think that's just a great exploration in something we talked about, which is just like playing off of the blues scale, just flat 7-1 and flat 3. He gets like a whole solo. He plays like 3 or 4 choruses off just like those notes. And then Dexter Gordon on Blue Bossa. Can you talk about Dexter a little bit, Gina?
Well, the Blue Bossa Solo is the first one that I transcribed,
Mm-hmm.
and it is long, but it's got a lot of language, and it's really clever in his way of developing motifs.
Yeah.
So it not only gives you like a lot of access to language that you can use and that you can steal, but also just in regards to phrasing. And then also Blue Bossa is one of those other tunes that is not a blues, but Solar, Blues, a Blues, and Blue Bossa are three similar tunes that are 12 bars, and they have like ideas that can be switched within each other. So ideas used on Solar can be used over Blue Bossa, and Blue Bossa can
Yeah.
be used over Now's the Time. So these are three good tunes that are simple tunes that have a lot of stuff that you can swap over on each other. So they're very complementary.
And one more I didn't put on here also is Curtis Fuller on Autumn Leaves with Benny Golson, Donald Golson. If you're interested in that, I actually already did a video on it. It's got full transcription for bass trombone players. A little self-plug there. It's free. Check out my YouTube and my website. It's all up there. I put all the valve indications and everything. It's a great solo exploration of playing. He plays harmonic minor and he plays the absolute stuffing out of harmonic minor scale. It's just so good.
Yeah, and you also have a lot of other resources on your website for education in other solos, maybe that aren't these tunes.
Yeah.
But a lot of 8vbebop resources can be found on Chris's website, and he has the solos written out for you as well as valve indications on most of them. And next week we'll have Jennifer Wharton, the lovely Jennifer Wharton of Jennifer Wharton's Bonegasm with us. So we hope you tune in on Wednesday. And if you're unable to tune in on Wednesday, we will have the recording up here on this playlist as well, with Dave Taylor, with Reginald Chapman, as well as small supplementary lessons from Chris and I.